When we left off in part 2, there's a link in the description if you haven't seen it. John Lennon had written a quiet little song about the act of remembering places before people. He wrote that song in 1965. 3 years later, he went a bit further in the lyrics of Glass Onion, saying, "I told you about strawberry fields. You know, the place where nothing is real. Well, here's another place you can go." Wikipedia tells us he wrote these lyrics to confuse people. An interesting word, similar to the word incorporate as confuse, is based on the past participle of a Latin word meaning mingle together, using the root fuse as in fusion. As mentioned in part 2, Strawberry Field was a children's home for quasi-orphans in the Liverpool neighborhood where John Lennon grew up. As a child, John used to play on the Strawberry Field grounds, or demesnes, a term we've used throughout parts 1 and 2 of this series that means an estate of land, and a term that's evolved into the modern word domain. But Strawberry Field wasn't real to either John or the orphans living there because it wasn't inheritable as real estate. Once enrolled, the young orphans had legal use of the land. They could be there, play there, sort of like a public park, but they had no claim on Strawberry Field as an estate of land, as real estate, because they were not its heirs. Historically, heirs were a different strata of people. In England, land grants were sometimes made by the king or queen to reward military service, but generally you had to be someone fairly important to be granted land. Recall that in part 1 we briefly touched on the land grant given to Edward Shelley by Henry VIII in 1540, and the kerfuffle that followed. Edward Shelley had some standing in the realm and held favor with the king. He was a member of the gentry, and was the brother of William Shelley, a justice of the Common Pleas. This gave him standing, or status, making the land given him an estate that was real and inheritable because of his fee simple ownership. The term real estate originally meant a royal grant of land based on the receiver's status in the realm, a realm being a royal area, also with the root word real. The etymology gods have shifted away from linking the real of real estate with the word royal, having derived from the Spanish word for royal, which is real. But if you're familiar with my work, you know that I distrust many mainstream etymological explanations. In this case, the etymological shift is easily disproven, a shift that now claims that the real of real estate simply means it's fixed or immovable land, as opposed to personal property, like furniture, that can be moved. So let's look at this more closely. Noah Webster makes the same distinction in the 1828 edition of his dictionary, that property is either real or personal, and that real estate consists in lands which descend to heirs. Personal property, according to Webster, is movable wealth called chattel. This suggests that chattel is separate and distinct from real estate property, and that would be true if real meant fixed. But it never meant fixed. It meant royal, and we can verify this in Francis Bacon's Elements of the Common Laws of England of 1636. Here, on page 43 of The Use of the Law, which is the book's second part, Bacon refers to chattel real, which is chattel royal, movable wealth going back to the legal executors or administrators working on behalf of the crown. Real chattel hasn't suddenly been made real because it's now somehow connected to the immovable ground. It's made real when it reverts back to royalty. And that's what the term real estate is saying, that all land was once part of the royal realm, but is now being held by someone else at the pleasure of the king. Not all chattel was real or royal originally, but all land was. and Bacon explains why here on page 30 of the use of the law. The reason why all land is holden of the crown, immediately or by mean lords, is this: the conqueror got, by right of conquest, all the land of the realm into his own hands in demesne. Notice that William didn't confiscate the land in Kent, the area where Gavelkind was in force, which allowed for multiple heirs rather than primogeniture, as we discussed in Part 1. The word estate comes from the French estat, meaning status, and you must have some status to hold land, either as gentry, as a knight, or as an heir. Since orphans cannot be heirs, nothing in Strawberry Field was real. They could use the land, but they couldn't inherit the land. Now, let's look at the song with a little help from my friends, and this cryptic line: what do you see when you turn out the light? I can't tell you, but I know it's mine. When the Beatles turn out the light, they can't tell you what they see because it's now dark. But whatever it is, they know as members of the Masonic elite that it's theirs. They are heirs at the elitist level, and were shown this in Jules Verne's Floating Island. In the story, the French take their jurisdiction with them everywhere. The same was true in corporate Britain. The Beatles weren't French, of course, but they're on the bus, in this case, on the ship or floating island. Everything they see is real, as in real estate and ownable, and their jurisdiction extends to wherever they happen to be. It's not confined to specific coordinates. It's everywhere and nowhere, a nowhere land. But it's still real because the extension of jurisdiction is an extension of the real realm. But if you're not a member of the gentry and you're not an heir, but you'd still like a shot at having some land, being rewarded for military service might be an option. In fact, this has been the incentive to populate or member military companies since war began. Bacon mentions this in Part 2 of his Elements, saying that to the nobles, knights, and gentlemen the king gave great rewards of land, and that those landholders enjoying knights' service should still be conserved in warlike exercises. And when remembering the army moved from conscription to voluntary recruitment, the elite had to find better incentives to talk the boys into fighting. That's where the Beatles come in. They were to be a part of that recruitment effort, promoted to the legal orphans and non-heirs of the realm. Notice that when Paul McCartney first maps out the circular storyline of the Magical Mystery Tour, the word recruiting appears prominently up near the beginning. If you doubt such anti-war activists as the Beatles could be involved in military recruitment, stay with me, because you've been lied to. The trip is a coach tour, not terribly different from Miss Marple's Tour 37 of Famous Houses and Gardens, which, it's important to note, was published by Agatha Christie in 1971. 4 years after Magical Mystery Tour was broadcast on British television screens. The Magical Mystery Tour wasn't a movie in theaters that the audience had to pay for. The controllers wanted the masses to see Magical Mystery Tour because it was a major piece of propaganda. For those who bought the double EP of the 6 songs in the TV movie, a booklet was included that storyboarded the tour, and we'll be looking at some stills from that as we go. The artwork was done by Bob Gibson, who explained his work this way: I simply tumbled ideas into each box, filling every scene with confusion. So here we have another content creator, if you will, pushing confusion, fusing or joining, in his art. The coach tour starts with Ringo and his Aunt Jessie, a callback to John growing up as a quasi-orphan with his aunt and uncle. Later, Paul is daydreaming that he's up on a hill, an elevated piece of land, useful for a monument, though in the booklet, the hill looks a lot more like a barrow. When the group arrives at the military recruitment office, the booklet says they're instructed, if they try to get you to join up, incorporate into the Corps, don't take any notice. In law, if you accept or take a notice, it's similar to accepting a summons. Taking a notice or summons is the same as being served. And this all seems to coincide with the Beatles' stated opposition to war. But it really doesn't matter what the Beatles tell your conscious brain. It matters what they tell your subconscious brain, with the imagery in their films and album covers, or the distorted musical tunings in their music, or what they do rather than what they say. It turns out only John was really opposed to war and the corporate state, because he was the only Beatle to give his MBE back. All 4 Beatles became members of the Order of the British Empire in 1965, and John held on to his for 4 years. The Order of the British Empire is an award given to either military or civilian individuals, and the Beatles were civilian recipients. But either way, the Order is a quasi-military organization, and the Beatles were not being rewarded by it for promoting peace. We need to be aware of who these people really were. John played along for a while, giving the Masonic hand symbol, along with Paul, who holds a knighthood, which is an even higher rank in this quasi-militaristic system than either an MBE or an OBE. Who were the knights? They engaged in combat and performed warlike exercises. George Harrison was offered an OBE after his MBE, but he turned this down because he felt he deserved a knighthood like Paul received. George died before all that could get sorted out, and Ringo, he was knighted just a few years ago, in 2018. Knowing all this, how solid do you really think the Beatles' anti-war stance was? Yes, the Beatles are civilian members of the Empire, and the MBE award originated during World War I for military and civilian service. But the service of civilians was described as taking place not on the front line. Civilians can absolutely help the war effort from other locations than the front line. The band was groomed from the start to perform a specific service, though not on the front line, for the perpetuation of the British Empire. And if we drill down a little deeper, we can see that service being walked out in the Magical Mystery Tour. Remember, national service ended in England in 1960, just before the Beatles really got going. National service was military conscription, the duty of the boys living in a municipality who grew up beating the bounds to remember. One reason conscription ended was because of the people's opposition to this draft, so recruitment efforts had to become more covert. This scene wasn't meant to prevent military recruitment or talk the boys out of it. It was meant to lower resistance to the process by mocking it, making it look silly and irrelevant and something to ignore, removing it from everyone's awareness or notice so that the population would have less resistance to it. Ultimately, the Beatles were climbing on a bandwagon of farcical war movies of the 1960s, taking the idea of the military away from war and death and pushing it into comedy and shtick. And this is exactly what Lester's movie, How I Won the War, was up to, turning war into a silly experience that wasn't threatening so much as it was absurd. And seeing the Beatles in military garb, even as farce, is useful when communicating to the subconscious. In 1963, the Beatles covered the song Till There Was You. It was released on their second album, With the Beatles, and they also performed it live, at the Royal Hall. The song was written by Meredith Willson for his magnum opus, The Music Man. The film version of that was released the year before in 1962. That film starts with a military marching band and a very military-sounding drum corps. This was American propaganda, intended to soften the public's perception of anything military. No foxholes, no guns, just an upbeat military-looking band, comedy, and a pretty singing girl, all in bright Technicolor. Both Meredith Willson and Robert Preston, the film's star, were involved with government propaganda. Willson was the musical director for the Armed Forces Radio Service. Willson also wrote Chicken Fat for JFK's program of physical fitness, which was sung by the Music Man's Robert Preston, as well as the song Win for Gerald Ford's campaign Whip Inflation Now. Preston appeared in several propaganda films to boost recruitment, including Parachute Battalion. He also narrated Sentinels in the Air, a short recruiting film put out by the Air Force Reserve in 1956. In The Music Man, Preston plays a man named Gregory, who calls himself Professor Harold Hill. He's a con man traveling from town to town, selling snake oil and then skipping town with the cash. But the snake oil he's selling is very unusual. He's selling boys' bands and he's selling uniforms. When he describes this boys' band, he pulls 4 names out of a hat as examples of boy musicians: Johnny, Willie, Teddy, Fred. It almost makes it sound like he's forming a pop group. But that wouldn't sell enough uniforms for Hill's larger vision. No, he's forming a boys' marching band. But it's the uniforms that are important, as he tells his friend. When the uniforms arrive, they forget everything else, at least long enough for me to collect and leave. He's not selling anything musical. He can't play, read, or teach music. He's selling an appearance, and by the time the town remembers, he's long gone.
Well, Professor Harold Hill's on hand. River City's gonna have her boys' band. As sure as the Lord made little green apples, and that band's gonna be in uniform. Johnny, Willie, Teddy, Fred.
Or in the category of Best Predictive Programming in a Musical.
Well, Professor Harold Hill's on hand. River City's gonna have her boys' band. As sure as the Lord made little green apples, and that band's gonna be in uniform. Johnny, Willie, Teddy, Fred.
5 years later, the Beatles would show up as an established boys' band in similar uniforms, and, I would argue, performing a similar task: to link the military with upbeat music to lower the public's resistance and increase recruitment. Notice that Hill mentioned Little Green Apples. The Apple record label the band put out in 1968 was owned by a parent company called Apple Corps, with a military play on words, the term corps meaning the main subdivision of an armed force in the field. And don't forget the double meaning of these words. In promoting boys' bands, a word that can mean a group of musicians, they're also promoting bands as strips of fascia that bind boys in a band of brothers or a military company. So how does all this relate back to the Genius Loci and the importance of place? First of all, Hill drums up demand for a boys' band by warning the people of River City that their boys will be frittering their time away on the town's new pool table, a situation that sounds very similar to the one described by Frederick Law Olmsted, the genius of outdoor space, in his speech warning of young men's vile pastimes in basements and of the solution to be found in public parks. Hill explains all this to the people as they gather in the public park of River City, Iowa, a town patterned after Wilson's hometown of Mason City, Iowa. And yes, Mason City refers to Freemasons. The town was founded in 1853, one of the Masonic numbers we keep encountering, and according to Wikipedia, the town had several Freemasonic-influenced names. Wikipedia goes on to say that Mason City is known for its musical and masonry heritage. This is an interesting link for Wikipedia to make because this link is not widely understood. But in the next octave, I show that, in ancient times, bricklayers were dubbed masons because they offset their stacked stones at the center, the musical mies of ancient Greek music. Freemasonry later facilitated the tuning system of equal temperament, which was perfected using the Masonic tools of a straight edge and compass. The Masonic connection to Rosicrucian thought is also hinted at in the lyrics of Meredith Willson's song, "Till There Was You," that the Beatles covered. There were bells on a hill, but I never heard them ringing. Bells on a hill could easily describe a monument or temple on an elevated piece of land, and it's interesting that Wilson gave his musical con man the last name of Hill. Then there was music and wonderful roses, they tell me, in sweet fragrant meadows of dawn and dew. This is a song about awareness, or the lack thereof. Many people go through their daily lives without ever hearing the bells on the hill, without hearing the music for what it is, without being aware of the symbolism of the roses, the dawn, the dew. Because of this, I suspect the lyrics are hiding something. In the awkward phrase, "till there was you," the word "you" could be standing in for the homophone yew, a tree that's highly poisonous, but its pollen, when inhaled, can be hallucinogenic, creating altered states of consciousness that often expand awareness. The words roses, dawn, and dew, clustered together in this verse, are specifically alluding to Rosicrucian elements. In my book, The Alchemical Solfeggio, I discuss the meaning of dew to the Rosicrucians. Hidden in the first two Dutch words of the Fama Fraternitatis is the English word dew. The Latin word rose refers to the alkahest, a universal solvent or universal dew that's sought after in alchemy. The Rosicrucian member Peter Binden has written that rose was an alchemical code name for the solvent of tartar, which takes us back to the symbolic role of Tartarus in alchemy. So Rosicrucianism helps us see the concave pit of Tartarus as a cup or crucis holding tartar, the alkahest or universal solvent called dew. And this brings us abruptly back to the Magical Mystery Tour, where we find another very prominent reference made to dew, when the tour bus is being tracked 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road. Dewsbury, as well as Leeds 10 miles up, and even the band's hometown of Liverpool, are all on the 53rd parallel north. Like the search party and Castaways made a trip along the 37th parallel south, the Beatles are making a trip along the 53rd parallel north. Back in River City, Iowa, that lacks Masonic coordinates but is based on a Masonic name, place versus name, the band uniforms are about to arrive. And the uniforms tie into a line from Lovely Rita on Sgt. Pepper. In a cap, she looked much older, and the bag across her shoulder made her look a little like a military man. Because the clothes make the man, or woman, I would argue that the Music Man, the Magical Mystery Tour, and Sgt. Pepper are all attempts to get boy or girl musicians into military garb. According to research done by Stacy on Mike Williams' Paul is Dead channel, the Beatles' fictional sergeant known as Pepper was likely a combined characterization of both John Philip Sousa, a sergeant in the Marines, and J.W. Pepper, a publisher of sheet music. Pepper happened to be born in 1853. On Pepper's company souvenir from the Chicago World's Fair, they boasted that the government had purchased $20,000 of product from them. But it was Susa who was the king of musical military marches. In 1881, Wikipedia tells us that Susa was initiated into Freemasonry at the Hiram Lodge No. 10 in Washington, D.C. But although the Beatles wore the colorful military band uniforms in Sgt. Pepper, only Paul wore military garb in the Magical Mystery Tour. Instead, the uniform of that film that all the boys wore was the white tuxedo, accessorized with 3 red carnations and 1 black. I'm not as interested in their colors. Other people have covered that angle at length. I'm more interested in the type of flower the Beatles are wearing, the carnation. There is some disagreement about what the word carnation actually means. But the Latin root carnis means flesh, and not surprisingly, the word carnation is just 2 letters away from the word incarnation, meaning to be made flesh, to be put into flesh, to be born. From here, the word reincarnation means to be born again, to be made flesh all over again after having previously done so. And to understand why the Beatles chose to wear carnations at the end of the Magical Mystery Tour, we need to go back to their roots in Liverpool, to the area in which they were born. Recall that just across the River Mersey from Liverpool is the town of Birkenhead, the most progressive place in the world, in the view of Frederick Law Olmsted, the genius of outdoor place, as well as Charles Loring Brace, the man who organized the slave labor placement of orphans. Now for me, the word progressive is not a positive one. I've done research for decades on how progressive thought and progressive policies have created several economic problems that have increased the divide between rich and poor rather than decreased it. Things like the minimum wage, which causes the layoffs of the very employees it's supposedly intended to help. Of course, the minimum wage law wasn't just a stupid economic policy that backfired. The law was passed on purpose to target layoffs of black employees in the 1930s. This racist agenda has been well documented. And one of the most progressive ideas ever was something called eugenics, a word we don't even use anymore because it's so negatively charged. Encyclopedia Britannica tiptoes around the term to define it as politely as possible. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 by British explorer and natural scientist Francis Galton, who, influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, advocated a system that would allow the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. Eugenics was, in effect, racism plus population control, rebranded as a choice that all progressive women would want to make, and it spawned Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood. That Sanger believed in eugenics is openly admitted on the Planned Parenthood website. Just in case you doubt how progressive these policies were, Michael Friedan, writing in the Historical Journal, explored the attraction eugenics held for progressives. The well-known progressives of the time were people like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill, the face of World War II, and Churchill's best friend, Frederick Edwin Smith, who happened to be born in Birkenhead. He's maybe less well-known, but was no less powerful. Smith was the Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain, and became the first Earl of Birkenhead in 1922. Because of this, he's now referred to as Birkenhead. In 1930, Birkenhead published a futurist book called The World in 2030, in which he wrote this: "By regulating the choice of the ectogenetic parents of the next generation, the cabinet of the future could breed a nation of industrious dullards." A further immediate consequence of ectogenesis would be a plea that society should be allowed to produce the human types it most needs, instead of being forced to absorb all the unsuitable types which happen to be born. Many of the arguments brought against slavery would be powerless in such a case, for the ectogenetic slave of the future would not feel his bonds. This quote is eugenics on parade, and Aldous Huxley would depict the idea just 2 years later in Brave New World. In his book, Birkenhead was hoping that in the future, eugenics could benefit from the technology of ectogenesis, which refers to the process of growing babies outside the body of a woman, for example, in a test tube and incubator. At the end of the 19th century, incubators displaying infants were all the rage at world's fairs. Sideshows like the Child Hatchery charged admission to see premature babies under the guise of generating funding for neonatal research. Dr. Martin Cooney's infantorium was located on Coney Island, which sat not on the 37th parallel, but its inversion, the 73rd meridian. But the fact that Cooney was only posing as a doctor suggests that the ectogenetic technology of the day was less than noble, perhaps something more akin to what Birkenhead described in The World of 2030. It's possible that the incubator craze decades earlier was more than simply about a technology to produce dullards, or even ectogenetic slaves. It may have also been an attempt to mass-produce soldiers by mass-producing infants. And this is where we see an unexpected connection between the Earl of Birkenhead's promotion of ectogenesis, right next door to Liverpool, where the Beatles were born 20 years later, and with both towns sitting on the 53rd parallel. Those carnations on the Beatles' tuxedos at the end of the Magical Mystery Tour symbolize being made flesh, coming into being through birth. The word carnation is also similar to the Gaelic word carn, meaning a heap of stones, and from which the Scottish word cairn derives. A cairn, like a barrow, is a monument, something we looked at in Part 1. Dictionary.com defines a cairn as a memorial, but a cairn only has the skeleton of a barrow monument. It lacks the soil covering it, the flesh of the barrow. So while a barrow is a monument to death, we might see the cairn, the dolmen, and even standing stones as monuments to birth, the greatest of all portals into physical reality. Many esoteric researchers, even today, describe dolmens and standing stone circles as portals in their own right. In a video collaboration, Michelle Gibson talks about Aleister Crowley, shown here on the Sgt. Pepper album cover, passing his infant son through a circular megalith at Menontoll in Cornwall, and there have been other legends of infants being passed through this stone, mostly for the purpose of healing. Perhaps such megaliths are memorials meant for more than simply thinking about the dead, but of symbolically remembering or recalling the dead back into the corpus of the living. Perhaps a cairn is a portal for incarnation, essentially repopulating the world through such portals, specific places marked by mounds, bounds, hills, ley lines, even coordinates. The Genius Loci, where we remember the earth through symbolic birth. And at this point, I should probably apologize to you for sharing misinformation in this video. In fact, I must apologize for letting it go this long because I had to fully explore the mainstream narrative. But the truth is that Genius Loci doesn't really mean the spirit of place, and this is why it pays to watch my videos to their conclusions. If we look at the etymology more critically, we find that the Latin word genio means to be born. The Genius Loci of ancient Rome means, literally, a place of birth, a birthplace. A genius is an act of creation, of incarnation. Its root, gene, is found in other words like gene, genealogy, and primogeniture. It's the creation of a generation of children, the same process of sending new souls to incarnate on the earth that Plato describes in the myth of However, the child's genius wasn't an attendant regulating divinity. It was the child's birthplace, its birth location, the coordinates at which the child entered the earth grid. In astrology, the location of a person's birth is important because, along with the time of birth, it determines the ascendant in the birth chart. According to Google AI, your birthplace's latitude and longitude pinpoint the exact placement of planets in your birth chart's 12 houses. So all of this, the orphans and anarchists in the valleys or pits, the Roman arches of hills, the inability to inherit land, the legal fight over the name versus place of a corpus or corporation, the ley lines, bearings, and beating of the bounds, and the tours along the 37th and 53rd parallels have all been recurring attempts to quietly recruit a new generation of infantry. Defined by Google AI as the soldiers who fight on foot and are the main land combat force in the military that capture and hold territory. They can't inherit the land, but they can hold on to it for the warlord. Google AI tells us that the term infantry comes from the Latin word infans, meaning unable to speak or child. In Renaissance Italy, infante referred to a youth or foot soldier too young or inexperienced for cavalry, leading to the military term infanteria, which entered English via French around the 14th century. Today, infantry refers to any soldiers who fight on foot, regardless of their age or experience. The military term troop can mean to walk, travel on foot, but it's also used to define a company or group of soldiers in war, not to mention a troop of boy or girl scouts, the grooming of children to enter warlike companies, earning pins and patches to display on brown and green uniforms, the colors of camouflage. The link between a war victory and the foot even takes us back to Romeo and Juliet in Act 1, Scene 1. Thou shalt not stir a foot to seek a foe. War starts with the foot. Jules Verne gives us similar imagery in the 21st chapter of The Children of Captain Grant. Manuel could not conceive of any state but a military one, and he hoped in due time, with the help of God, to offer the Republic a whole company of young soldiers. Pepe, hearing himself complimented, brought his 2 little feet together and presented arms with perfect grace. In light of the nature of a fighting infantry, the story of the pirate Blackbeard takes on possibly new meaning. According to Court Lindahl, Blackbeard was hung along with 12 of his crewmates in 1719 at Williamsburg, Virginia. His skull was then raised on a pike at the entrance of Hampton Harbor, sitting exactly on the 37th parallel. Years later, this skull was said to have been silver-plated and used as a punch bowl known as the infant. To turn the dome of a skull into a basin is to invert the hill into a valley, and is also a symbolic move from the head to the foot. There are many ways to kill someone, but the symbolism of separating body parts, especially the head, speaks to dismemberment as something even more powerful than death. The message of a story of dismemberment, like that of Osiris, is that it's dangerous to become separated from the corpus, the body, the group. That the infantry fights on foot is a symbol of militarism that goes back to Perseus, who founded the city of Tarsus in Turkey, when an oracle told him to build a city where his foot first touched the ground after a victory in war. The resulting city of Tarsus is where the tarsal and metatarsal bones of the foot get their name. I was first made aware of the importance of Tarsus by my friend Dane Quirk, Saturn Rooster on YouTube. He pointed out to me that Tarsus sits next to the city of Adana, a symbolic coupling of heaven and hell, with Tarsus being a name close to Tartarus and Adana similar to Eden. You'll recall from Castaways that another Eden, this one in Australia, sits on the 37th parallel south, while this Eden, Adana in Turkey, is located on the 37th parallel north. So maybe it's time to return to Australia and the 37th parallel south to tie this whole story together. As I've discussed elsewhere, remembrance is the metaphorical rebinding of a body held together with the fascia membrane. It's a fascist, corporatist bond of the corpus body. Likewise, the word remember or recalling memories is about repopulating or recalling, calling back, the members of a group, especially groups that engage in combat. There are hints of this play on words everywhere. Going back to Jules Verne's Floating Island, we find this one. Were there any soldiers in Floating Island? Yes, a body of 500 men under the orders of Colonel Stewart, for it had to be remembered that some parts of the Pacific are not always safe. It's saying one thing, but giving very specific imagery when the words are parsed. A body of men. It had to be remembered. In another video, I also discussed that the rhyme, remember, remember the 5th of November, is not only a line telling people to memorialize the gunpowder plot, but an instruction to repopulate the movement to carry it out. The people on Tour 37 in Nemesis are following a ley line or path that's rising to the location of a memorial tower, a place for remembering the dead. And on the 37th parallel south, there's another very well-known place for remembering the dead killed in war. It's called the Shrine of Remembrance. This shrine occupies another position in Australia that's been the subject of Dane Quirk's research on his Saturn Rooster channel. Its coordinates cause my work and Dane's to overlap. The 144th meridian east and the 37th parallel south. Dane has found alignments of recurring values between the shrine, the municipality of Eden, the Parliament House Pyramid in Canberra, and the lighthouse on Montague Island. For example, Dane noticed that the distance from the tip of the pyramid over Parliament House to the lighthouse on Montague Island was 144 kilometers long. This is 144,000 meters, echoing the number of 144,000 white casing stones on the pyramid in Giza. And as mentioned before, the Shrine of Remembrance, also with a step pyramid over a Romanesque building, sits at the longitude of 144 degrees east. Dane also realized that the alignment from Parliament House to Montague Island passes right over a mountain called Mount Moruya, as well as several large granite megaliths, 10 meters high. Recall that the name Montague means pointed hill, and the name Capulet suggests a pyramid capstone. Moruya is also a pointed hill, and its name derives from an Aboriginal word meaning resting place of the black swans. Dane believes this refers to a Viking ship in the shape of a swan that capsized there. You can find more information on this at his Saturn Rooster YouTube channel. What's interesting in the overlap of our work is the prevalence of these Masonic numbers 37 and 53. In my research, I found that the numbers show up in modern travel distances too. 553 kilometers from the Shrine of Remembrance to Eden, and 53.5 kilometers, or 53 minutes, from Adana to Tarsus. The Shrine of Remembrance is an Australian National War memorial, built in Melbourne on a 50-foot artificial hill. The memorial was dedicated in 1934, which happens to be 37 years before Nemesis was published, a novel that includes a temple being killed at a monument on a hill. In my own research, I found that using the 37th line of latitude as a baseline, the alignment of the shrine up to the Parliament House Pyramid in Canberra is also 37 degrees. And from the 37th latitude, the Pukapunyal Army Base sits at a 53-degree angle from the alignment of the Shrine of Remembrance to Parliament House. One of the statues at the Shrine of Remembrance is called Father and Son. According to the shrine's website, the statue was created to honor the courage and sacrifice of 2 generations of Victorians who served and died in the First and Second World Wars. It is symbolic of the service of many Victorian families in which the father served in the First World War and the son in the Second World War. The implication is clear. For many sons in early 20th century Australia, it wasn't land, but the legacy of serving in a war that was the inheritance they received from their fathers. I would suggest that the Shrine of Remembrance at 37 degrees south was intentionally placed at this symbolic coordinate to create a very specific genius loci, or birthplace, for a concept, the perpetuation of war. It's obvious that simply encouraging many minds to focus on war will perpetuate it, but the process goes much deeper than that. A memorial of remembrance is a form of recruitment that binds us with emotions of us versus them, causing the old to grieve for friends lost to earlier wars, and solidifies the population's resolve for continuing what feels like their own principled fight. Of course, the Shrine of Remembrance didn't yet exist when Jules Verne wrote his novel exploring the 37th parallel, but he was doing something similar in The Children of Captain Grant, using the symbolism of Eden, the symbolic birthplace of humanity, to glorify the corporate municipality, which is just another feature of the company, the group, the platoon, the business that dissolves individual accountability in large numbers. You might not convince boys to kill individually, but you can easily convince boys and girls to kill when they're anonymized within a corporate body. In a podcast on the shrine, Dale Holmes and his guest Nikki Penford describe these jagged angular pits at the shrine as being called sperm egg. In fact, Nikki also explains that the model for the shrine was called the embryo. For me, this symbolism is about remembering war through the act of birth. When Dane first shared his alignments in this area with me, I asked him if there was anything interesting at the Mies point, the center between Montague and what I see as Capulet, the capstone of Parliament House. When he measured it out, Dane found that what sat at the Mies point of this alignment was a gigantic pit called the Big Hole. It's a perfect metaphor, the big hole as a concave womb to house the offspring created by the incorporation of Montague and Capulet. This is birth symbolism, the incarnation on the tuxedo of the elites, used to encourage recruitment through repopulation, but its most important feature is that it's ectogenetic. This womb isn't inside Juliet, it's outside her body, her corpus, at the Mies between Juliet and Romeo, just like an incubator on Coney Island. Simply by providing the Capulet and Montague context, the controllers were turning the big hole into a genius loci, a symbolic place of birth. And this isn't the only genius loci to be found in this area. Another ancient womb is located here, known as Gulaga, with the modern name of Mount Dromedary. To the Aboriginals, Gulaga symbolizes the mother, and Dane found that the alignment between Montague Island and the Shrine of Remembrance, the sperm, the egg, the embryo, passes straight through Gulaga without any deviation. According to Wikipedia, Gulaga holds particular significance for Aboriginal women. The mountain is regarded as a symbolic mother figure, providing the basis for the people's spiritual identity. Gulaga is located on the 36th parallel south. The number 36 is not Masonic, it's harmonic. It's a multiple of 9 and represents the second octave of D, which is harmonic 9. For the purpose of birth symbolism, the 36th latitude would have been a harmonic, healthy place to symbolize birth, though there's no evidence that the Aboriginals acknowledged modern latitudes. But the controllers do acknowledge them, and they also distort harmonics, which is why the numbers in the Masonic logo are 37 and 53 rather than 36 and 54. You can see that the interval they form is a distortion of the perfect fifth between D and A. But the Aboriginals weren't only focused on female birth symbolism. Gulaga was the mother of 2 sons, one of them being Baranguba, the landmass of Montague Island, which was also on the 36th parallel south. Dane learned from an elder that Montague Island was historically a place for young male initiation. And going back to Perseus, the demigod who founded Tartarus by placing his foot on that location, Google AI tells us that the Perseus cult, which was the religion worshipping him, focused on specific male initiation rites. These rituals involved tests or contests for young men to prove their worth and move toward full citizenship. Google goes on to say that the process of adolescent male initiation generally involves fostering a new identity with a focus on responsibility to the group. A group can also be described as a company or a corporation, and this is the same initiation rite the Shrine of Remembrance is attempting to conjure on the 37th parallel south, fostering an identity defined by a responsibility to the group and moving toward full citizenship. They want young men coming to the shrine with their families to feel a strong call of duty, a remembrance, emanating from this Genius Loci. Aboriginal women weren't allowed on Baranguba or Montague Island, at least during these male initiations, and the females would instead congregate on Gulaga as their Genius Loci. Likewise, when the Shrine of Remembrance first opened, women were not allowed into the building, despite the fact that many mothers and girlfriends had many remembrances of their lost loved ones. But the shrine wasn't really about the memories of lost soldiers in the hearts of their relatives. It was about the literal repopulating and rebinding of military companies as a male initiation rite. Fascism is the ultimate expression of the corporate form, a generation bound to one another. Remember Miss Marple's fascinator from part 1? To fasten or fascinate is to bind or clasp together, and her fascinator gave Miss Marple a remembrance right at the outset in chapter 1 of Nemesis. The purpose of a remembrance is to repopulate the company of anonymous members, because when the corporation acts as one, its individual members are no longer liable for what the group has done. According to Wikipedia, fascism is concerned with a concept called palingenesis, which is a national rebirth or regeneration, a birthing process on the macro scale, or the birthing of groups. As such, members of the nation's rebirthed body are held together by its national fascia, which all just boils down to this: the members can't opt out. Fascism requires that everyone join in, become incorporated with the nation as a whole. On the micro scale, the members must be born into immediate fascial bonds. It's not something bestowed when members come of age. Initiation is no longer an issue for adolescents. This is why modern fascism, the incorporation of the world, must start with the infant. The fascia holds the body members together, its membership, and fascism, through palingenesis and regeneration, ensures there's a new body to hold together when the old body has become completely outmoded. The ley lines of this legal corporate reality converge in the tragic romance, the play all about the legal inheritance of land, Romeo and Juliet, as Friar Lawrence gives the following soliloquy tying it all together. The earth, that's nature's mother, is her tomb. What is her burying grave? That is her womb. And from her womb children of divers kind, we sucking on her natural bosom find. Many for many virtues excellent, none but for some, and yet all different. O mickle is the powerful grace that lies in herbs, plants, stones, and their true qualities. For naught so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Nor aught so good but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometimes by action dignified. Within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence and medicine power. For this being smelt, with that part cheers each part. Being tasted, slays all senses with the heart. Two such opposed kings encamp them still, in man as well as herbs, grace, and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up that plant. Friar Lawrence is contemplating the poisonous flower, growing from the same earth as those that do the world good, and his commentary on the poisonous flower uses words that we've studied all along in this video. Children, womb, birth. Stones, earth, use, residence, and ultimately the word infant. Shakespeare, using Bacon's pen, was warning that the most powerful weapon wielded by kings is the infant. It's the young people who are expected to fight the wars of the old people. This was expressed in Nemesis by the sister of Verity Hunt's killer, a spinster living out her old age in the manor house, commenting on the disposable nature of the young. During the war, one could not get any gardeners. We had a very young gardener, and then he was called up. One does not, of course, grudge that. That's what the young are for. And so Miss Marple ends her truth hunt, in which she attempted to solve the murder of the young by their perpetually warring fathers and mothers. She ends that hunt by acknowledging the power of Roman or romantic love to draw recurring generations of infantry into prolonging wars they didn't start. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.